All right, how do I?
Okay.
Okay.
No, that's good. You can work.
I'm good, and I have a complete head.
It's been about 35 minutes last Sunday without a head.
Yes.
I seen it, but we were live, so I just left you with the headless Sunday school teacher.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
I think the preacher seen it finally come over and move it.
That
I said,
he
well, they
fixed
don't
it.
need to see his head, they just need to hear him.
Well, everyone, we have a 2 minutes before we start, but we're going to be in Daniel 4, 28 to 37. So as we get ready to start, that would be the verses that we covered today. Nine, we're all right, almost 10 o'clock. All right. Oh, good morning, everybody. It's 10 o'clock. Thank you for coming to Sunday school. And we're in Daniel 4, 28 to 37. And so as we continue Daniel, we'll see the characters are that we're going to see. One of them is Nebuchadnezzar again. And then we're going to see God's interaction with him. So as we get ready to start, the question I have is, where do we believe God is in our success? Because that question will determine several things. It will determine if I'm responsible completely for my own success, then I can take credit for it. And if I'm not responsible for my success, who is? And I should give him credit for it. So in the context this week, because we're going to start right at the end of the context. So King Nebuchadnezzar, as we've seen, he's had dreams, and we see that those dreams have been interpreted for him. So King Nebuchadnezzar related how he had dreamt of a dream that frightened him, but none of his wise men could interpret it. So that's in Daniel 4, 4 to 7 as we get to these verses. And how he asked Daniel to help him understand the dream in verses 8 and 9. Now you have to remember, Daniel and his friends were empowered by God. They didn't eat the same diet because they were wanting to live according to God's law. And so by the time they went to see the king, it had transpired that even the people that were taking care of them saw that they were doing better and healthier on their own Jewish diet rather than that king's diet. So they allowed them to do that. They go before the king, and the king recognizes how just well trained, how smart, how everything else about them is just above and beyond everyone else. And Daniel, the first time he talks about one of the king's dreams, the king had a horrible test for the dream. And the test was, I'm not going to tell you what the dream is. You're going to tell me what I dreamt, and you're going to tell me what it means. And so, of course, none of his wise men could do that. And so Daniel, through God, was able to do that. So now what we see is Daniel was he asked Daniel about the dream. And in the dream, he saw a magnificent tree that reached to the sky and brought blessings to many creatures, and that's in 10 to 12. He heard a voice calling from the tree to be cut down. Only a stump with iron and bronze bands remained around it. And then the object of the dream wood experience a great humiliation until he recognized God's supremacy, and that's in verses 16 to 18. So the king is given this dream, and Daniel is able to tell him what it means. And then Daniel's interpretation of the dream is in verses 19 to 26, right before the verses we're covering today. And so Nebuchadnezzar had become exceedingly great. However, he would experience great humiliation until he recognized God's sovereignty. And that's in 22 to 25. Daniel stressed that the dream contained the possibility of the king's restoration and encouraged him to pursue righteousness in 26 and 27. So here, now remember, Daniel has already interpreted another dream that none of his wise men could do, and the three companions were thrown in the furnace, and the furnace was so hot it killed the guards that threw them in, and yet they were unharmed. They didn't even smell like smoke. They weren't singed. And Nebuchadnezzar saw the fourth being with them. And so he called them out, and he even said he recognized that their God was a true God, and said anybody even speaks bad about their God was to be ripped apart and their houses basically turned into a garbage dump. So you would think, if you were King Nebuchadnezzar and you had on your council these godly men, that it would have an effect in your life. And yet, that's not what we see. A year later, Nebuchadnezzar, and this is going to be what we talk about today, Nebuchadnezzar walked about his palace and reflected on his own greatness. Immediately, he heard a voice from heaven announcing the fulfillment of the dream had come, and Nebuchadnezzar received the mind of an animal as judgment from God. And when God restored the king's reason to him, we will see that the king will affirm God's greatness. And many years later, King Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, held a feast for 1,000 nobles, and this is in 5:1. He used the sacred temple vessels from God's temple in Jerusalem to worship idols as they partied, and suddenly this is where we see the mysterious hand writes the words on the palace walls. So with those words, of course, they were terrified. The queen suggested to Belshazzar that he summon Daniel, and that's in 10 to 12. And the king asked Daniel, which this is a new king, about the handwriting. So in doing so, Daniel first reminded Belshazzar of the great lesson of humility the king's predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, had learned. And that's in 5:17 to 21. Belshazzar had learned nothing from this and instead had committed great evil. So the question on this background, and now we see another king was aware of it, and it didn't impact their life. So as we read the Bible, we see all of these stories, we see all the things that are going on. And so do we learn from the conduct of others and their consequences? Or do we just see it like King Belshazzar? That happened to them. It was just a story. Good thing I'm not them. Or do we actually see their conduct had a consequence? And the Bible provides us examples of not living for God along with their consequences. It also provides examples of living for God. And once again, what are the consequences? So as we read the Bible and we read these stories, they're not just old stories. They are, we know the conduct God wants. And we have these stories of the conduct that people do instead. And so do we take that to heart? Do we learn from their mistakes, or do we try and repeat their mistakes? And so that is something for us to think about today, because we're reading about something that happened thousands of years ago, and it's not just an old story. It is a lesson. It is something for us to consider, and we're going to see his conduct and see if we fall into the same trap. So in starting in verses 28, all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. So when we start out, that means it's summarizing verses 4 to 27 that we're not covering. So we have the consequences, we have what's going to happen, and then all of this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon. So now we have a little background. He is basically on his palace looking out over everything. And so the king exclaimed, "Is this not Babylon the Great that I have built to be a royal residence by my vast power and for my majestic glory?" So he's looking out over the kingdom and he's taking credit for everything. I'm my own man. I'm responsible for everything. Look at what I have done. Nobody can claim any of this. Nobody helped me along the way. Only through my own power have I done this. So this is the warning to us. The significant accomplishments or achievements in our lives may tempt us to become proud. Nevertheless, we must remember God has given us our gifts and talents, and that's in 1 Corinthians 4:7. We should be grateful rather than proud. And so that is his view of it. He is totally responsible. So I would ask this: do we also have this mental position on what we have accomplished and amassed? You know, and we see it on TV. We see tremendously wealthy people, and they have motivational classes. They have all sorts of statements. They're quoted. We see, if you do like this person does, you too will be like him. Maybe you can amass wealth. But that goes on the idea that I am responsible for all the good in my life. And in life, a lot of times we want to take credit for all the good, and we blame others for all the bad. So if something bad in our happens in our life, that's not really my fault. This happened, that happened. It's somebody else's. But if it's good, I am solely responsible. So this goes back to a problem that we're going to see in the story, and keep this in mind. Are you the creator of wealth, or are you the steward? Because those two ideas are opposite of each other. Because if you're the creator of wealth, you only answer to yourself. All this wealth is mine. It's everything I have is mine. I am totally responsible only to me for what I do. I can spend it lavishly on myself. I can do whatever I want because only I gave it to me, and so only I am responsible. Or are we a steward? Because and that's what we're going to see, about Nebuchadnezzar. He thought he was responsible for everything. He alone. And just like in our own lives, if we look at our lives and we say, or I say to myself, I am only a steward of what I have. And as being a steward, that means I am responsible to somebody else for what I have done and what I do with what has been given to me. And so if we have that attitude, then we'll better understand the lesson on the talents, where they had a parable of a person gave his servants each a certain number of talents, and they invested it, and they came back. And when they came back to the master, he told them what a good job they did, and then he rewarded them. And yet you see the one person who buried his and did nothing. And so even what he had was taken away. So the idea that I own my own wealth or I'm a steward will affect how do we live as a Christian. If God is blessing me, then surely he's blessing me to do something other than just squander it on myself. So in verse 31 to 32. While the words were still in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven. So the response from God was immediate. It did not come as a dream, and did not need interpretation. So the other messages from God that came to the king required were communicated to the king in a dream, and the dreams were impossible to understand. They required that the king would seek out a man whom God would empower to explain the meanings of the dream. So before, God's communication to the king had been in dreams, and he would have to search out Daniel to interpret the dreams. And then God sent the king to a godly man to discover what God says. Isn't that the gospel message today? Who tells the lost, the non-believers, what God says? We do. We bring it the message of salvation. We bring it, we say, this is what God says in the Bible. And here we have the king who knows this person is on his royal court, and he knows he hears from God, and yet it hasn't changed him. So even though the king has godly men in his council, he has remained unchanged. And so because of that now, and because of his pride, there is no pause. There is no dream. He doesn't have to go and ask somebody, what does God mean? This is what a voice came from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared that the kingdom has departed from you. So we'll stop right there for a second. To take the kingdom away means it's not really yours. And since it's not really his, he doesn't get a choice in it. He doesn't get to hold out against God. He doesn't have a battle to save the kingdom. He doesn't have a battle plan to stop it. Nothing. The kingdom, just as it was given to him, it is now taken away, just that quickly. In 32, you will be driven away from the people to live with the wild animals, and you will feed on the grass like cattle for 7 periods of time. Now we go, not only is the kingdom not yours, all this wealth you've amassed, all the power that you have, all the grandeur and how you live, not only has that instantly been taken away, his life is not his own. Now he's discovering, okay, not only do I not control everything that I thought I did that made me strong and powerful and wealthy, I don't even control my own life, because that's what we're saying. And then until you acknowledge, he is going to have to understand the truth and act on that truth. And by acting upon it is when he can acknowledge it. So he's going to learn the truth about who gave him power, and then he's going to acknowledge it. So he's going to remain for 7 years like this until you acknowledge. Now here's what he has to acknowledge: that the Most High God, that the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms, and he gives them to anyone he wants. So the idea that King Nebuchadnezzar made his own kingdom, I'm my own man, we hear that sometimes today. I don't want to work for anybody. I don't want to, whatever the thought is but the core of the thought is, I'm going to make myself. And whatever and however big I make myself is only my doing. No one else can take credit for it. And this is the king, and he's going to have to acknowledge that the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms, and he gives them to anyone he wants. So the fact that King Nebuchadnezzar had this great kingdom, and he was powerful, and he was ruling all of these different countries, it wasn't because King Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest, the smartest, the most powerful. It's because God was using King Nebuchadnezzar the entire time for God's plan. And being used in God's plan, we see that with these Old Testament kingdoms that come and punish or take over Egypt, and then the kingdom itself is overthrown because God is using those kingdoms for the betterment of his own people. And so those kingdoms, they will come and go, and they do not make themselves. We don't have to worry about a giant kingdom rising and what is the hazard of it, because we see here, God gives them to anyone he wants, and the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms. There is no kingdom in charge that set itself. So that tells us what is Nebuchadnezzar going to learn. And then we're going to see what happens now. At that moment, so God spoke and acted. God spoke directly to Nebuchadnezzar, and he acted right then. At that moment, the message against Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people. He ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with dew from the sky until his hair grew like eagle feathers, which would just be a ratted mess, and his nails like bird claws. And so, to give you an idea, so he went from somebody that lived in a palace that had, great meals anytime he wanted it, anytime, day or night, fabulous feast. He had everything. And now he has lost his kingdom. He's running around in the wild like a cow, eating the grass, and even his body is in disarray. He doesn't have control. He is being shown, if you have something you're in control of, show us, right? Because everything has been taken away. So obviously there is no part of his life that King Nebuchadnezzar is responsible for or has control of, because God has removed that control from him. In 34, but at the end of those days, which we said 7 years, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, and my sanity returned to me. So the period of judgment has ended. And so, just as we saw in verse 32, that King Nebuchadnezzar will, when he totally experiences this, and he sees for himself the majesty of God, he, even though he is not a Jew, he is going to acknowledge it. And this is what we see. And I'm going to hit 7 different things that you might be able to group them into 8, but I like 7. So then, now this is number 1. Now, when his sanity returned to him, this is the result. 1, then I praised the Most High and honored and glorified him who lives forever. So the first response we see from King Nebuchadnezzar after his period of living like an animal, having everything taken away, when his sanity returns, he praised the Most High and he honored and glorified him who lives forever. And so when we have Sunday worship service and we sing, we have a message, we have tithe, in all of that, we are trying to do what he is doing here. And that's what our service is. Praise the Most High, honor and glorify him who lives forever. 2, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion. So God's power isn't transitory. He is not going to rule for a while and then someone will come and rule after him. His dominion is everlasting dominion. 3, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. So God's dominion never ends, and his kingdom, the generations are us, because God is eternal, from generation to generation. 4, all the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing. So finally, Nebuchadnezzar sees his significance when he understands God, who he has just glorified and honored. And in understanding God, he finally sees his own significance. His own significance is all the inhabitants are counted as nothing. Now, that counted as nothing is also amazing because that is a truth. And yet, in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, we see they're looking for the Messiah. And the New Testament, the Messiah comes. And so we have Emmanuel, God with us, who died for us, even though we still count as nothing. God himself loved us so much, he provided a means for us to be saved. So that Nebuchadnezzar here shows he understands this insignificance of people. And 5, he does what he wants with the army of heaven and the inhabitants of earth. So both in heaven and in earth, God's will is done. He does what he wants with the army of heaven and the inhabitants of earth. So when we hear the Lord's Prayer, does that now that phrase, that God does what he wants in heaven and with the inhabitants of earth, thy will be done on heaven as it is on earth. So we see this truth here. Nebuchadnezzar truly sees these truths after he has his sanity returned. Number 6, there is no one who can block his hand. Now, Nebuchadnezzar truly knows that, because when God spoke to him, Nebuchadnezzar, there was no fight. How could you fight God? There was no calling the army. There was nothing. There is no one who can block his hand. Or number 6, that's 6. Or number 7, or say to him, what have you done? So in number 6, God is all powerful. Who can stop? Who can block his hand? Who can fight against God? No one, because he's all powerful. Number 7, that says, who can, basically, what have you done? To say, what have you done is to bring judgment. Because if you ask somebody, what have you done? You're asking them to explain their action so that you can see if that action is good. And in determining that, you will make a judgment. And so you cannot ask, what have you done? Because there is no one to judge God. And so there is no, what have you done? And we see in Job, when there's a lengthy discourse that's between God and Job that asks, where were you when the foundations of the earth were laid? And then all of these different, where were you? That also brought Job to a point where he understood, how could he judge God? Because if you judge God, what you're looking to say is what you did was right or wrong. And how can you be one to judge God and determine his actions are wrong? So these 7 things are truths that we need to remember today. And they are truths that Nebuchadnezzar, a non-Jew, non-believer, when he was confronted with God, he understood this. In verse 36 to 37, at that time, now we're going to have 5 things that I'm going to talk about. My sanity returned to me. So that's number 1. So at the end of the judgment, his sanity returned. Number 2, and my majesty and splendor returned. Now, the thing to remember on these things that are happening, all of them, Nebuchadnezzar didn't command any of them to happen. Nebuchadnezzar is the recipient of them. So all of these things that we're going to see are blessings from God to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar did not do any of them. They're all something God did for him. So number 1, his sanity returned. So he had 7 years to try and command his own sanity to happen? It never happened until God gave it back to him. Number 2, my majesty and splendor returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. He could not command the majesty and glory to return. God gave them. Number 3, my advisors and nobles sought me out. So you can imagine during the 7 years of his description and eating grass, nobody is coming to ask him, what should we do? Nobody is seeking him out. Nobody probably wants to even be associated with him during that time. So here, his advisors and nobles are seeking him out. 4, I was reestablished over my kingdom. So that kingdom that he is ruling, at a moment when God spoke it, he wasn't ruling it anymore. He had no splendor, he had no majesty, no, he had no sanity. When God spoke, it occurred. And he, as a person, had nothing that he could fight or to restore it on his own. And yet we see on number 4, now God is this, I was reestablished over my kingdom. So he has back what God had taken. He is blessed. And number 5, even more greatness came to me. And so not only was it returned to him, but in God's blessing, he has more than he had before. In 37, now all of this has occurred. All of this has happened. And we see he's already praised God. He understands that God did this, that there is none like God. And then we see after he honors God in 34 and 35, in 36, we see the result. And in 37, now, this is Nebuchadnezzar again. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heavens. That is the result of coming and being confronted with who you are and who God is. And because now he praises and he praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heaven, because all his works are true and all his ways are just. Now, this is coming from a person who just lost his kingdom, lost his sanity, lost all of his grandeur, was living like a cow, eating grass. We get a description of his personal appearance as horrible. And now, with it being returned, he knows all his works are true and his ways are just. So that last sentence about who can say, what have you done? No one. Because even King Nebuchadnezzar, who went through this, knows all his ways are just. Then he ends, he is able to humble those who walk in pride. And so the king had 7 years ago said, I made all of this, and in an instant it was gone. So as we read this story, I have a few more comments. Do you see yourself as the owner of your wealth, or do you see yourself as a steward? Because that will change how you feel about the money or about your possessions. It will change the way you understand God and God blessing you. And it will also keep God primary in your life. It's not, you can't have God is number one in everything except I made myself. So in this category, I'm number one and God's number two because I did everything. God is number one in every facet of our life as a Christian. And with that, we understand what is our role in helping God further God's kingdom. God blesses each and every one of us. And we are stewards who will be accountable for how we managed God's kingdom. We manage it. How do we manage the church funds? How do we manage our own funds? How do we manage our own life? All of these things, we're stewards. And so if you're solely responsible for all that you have, then that's the way you're going to treat your time, your money, and your life. Because you made it, you can do it however you want. Or has God blessed you and you understand that you are a steward of those blessings and that you are responsible to God for the proper use of what you have been given? God has blessed you. Do you use those blessings as a steward that is concerned with furthering God's kingdom? So that is the question. And we see a great lesson from Nebuchadnezzar, and we see even everything that he went through. When he had his sanity returned, he understood who God was. And he understood that God is just. And in understanding that, we see the 5 things that were returned to him. And he was blessed. He was blessed because 1, he got it back. And 2, he was blessed because number 5, even more greatness came to me. So when a non-believer, when King Nebuchadnezzar, who has the Jews in Babylon, he's got them enslaved, he's got all of this, and yet when he acknowledges God, we still see that he is blessed. So as we have our own lives and we get concerned, we have all of these life problems of what am I going to do, what's going on in the world, all of these things. Do we remember what Nebuchadnezzar said? Isn't it just something that if we remember what Nebuchadnezzar said, how much that would do for our Christian life? And he wasn't even a Christian. And then in 36 to 37, after we acknowledge who God is, do we live for God? And we see that God will bless us. God, and it doesn't mean that we'll have a kingdom. It doesn't mean any of that. What it means is living for God is the minimum. That is the minimum standard. And we don't live for God because we're going to get rich or we're going to have an easy life or anything else. We live for God because of our relationship and because God has already given us everything and we already have a kingdom we're going to. So that miracle there, that we're saved and I have no payment I can give on my own. That's why Christ had to die for us. I have no payment I can give. I cannot ransom myself. So I just want to say, as we look at King Nebuchadnezzar, if we remember what King Nebuchadnezzar said, we will have a really good foundation on who is God. So I thank everyone for coming this morning. And David, if I could ask you to close us in prayer.
Dear Lord, we thank you for being able to come to your house this morning to study your word and to hear how you are able to control, even at that time, one of the most powerful men. We thought he could control everything and thought he had done it himself. And we know that we can do nothing without you allowing it or you ordaining it. We just pray that you will help us to remember these things as we go out into the world each and every day, that everything we have, you've allowed us to have, and that we owe it to you. We should honor you with it, and we should give you the respect you are due. Just pray that you will be with us as we get ready to go into the service this morning. Be with Brother John as he prepares to bring the message to the Lord. Pray that you'll be with us as we sing praises to you, to honor you. And pray that you'll meet with us this morning again in the worship service. All these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Wood.